bearing. Come along, let's go to bearing. Won't you come along, let's go to bearing. Way over in the new bearing ground. Sinner, don't you hear my Lord calling? Sinner, don't you hear my Lord calling? Oh, sinner, don't you hear my Lord calling? Way over in the new bearing ground. Oh, the hammer keep ringing in somebody's coffin. The hammer keep ringing. Water boy. Somebody's coffin.
The Apalachicola River flows silently past Prospect Bluff. The sounds of nature and an occasional passing boat are the only disturbances to the quiet that envelops this place. 200 years ago, this was the scene of a bloody battle that ended with the deadliest cannon shot in American history.
A force of U.S. troops under Lieutenant Colonel Duncan Lamont Clinch came down the river from what later became Fort Scott, Georgia. Two U.S. Navy gunboats came up the river. They attacked the fort early on the morning of July 27, 1816. They fired a number of shots at the fort to kind of establish their range. And one of the boat commanders, Sailing Master Bassett, came up with the idea of heating the cannonballs red hot and launching them up over the earthwork and palisade walls of the fort, hoping to set the fort on fire. They did this. The very first of these hot shot that they fired sailed over the walls of the fort, and it's believed struck the gunpowder magazine, one of 3 gunpowder magazines in the British post.
In a sudden flash of fire and destruction, 270 men, women, and children were killed. Pieces of their bodies were scattered across Prospect Bluff. Some were even found high in the tops of longleaf pine trees.
Battle-hardened men of the U.S. Army come up here and start crying visibly, and they're shaken, and Clinch included. You get an idea just how massive and how they never experienced any of this, particularly with women and children and body parts all over the place. It was quite a traumatic event for everybody.
270 men, women, and children killed. About 50 or so survived the blast. Of that number, only about 27 survived any length of time after this explosion. It remains to this date the deadliest known cannon shot in American history, and it destroyed this free black or free African American colony that had been established here at Prospect Bluff. It was the end of freedom for the survivors. They were carried away back into slavery, most of them.
The story of the fort at Prospect Bluff is one of the most remarkable in American history. It was built by the British in 1814 and has been called many names: British Post, Negro Fort, Fort Negro, Fort Blunt, and finally Fort Gadsden.
I've talked to people just in the last month, never heard of Prospect Bluff or Fort Gadsden, or as we know it, the Negro Fort. And they said, the Negro Fort, I never heard of it. I said, this was a fort that was built by the British, and when they abandoned it, they was taken over by Maroons Cyrus and Prince and Gaston, and this was a fully armed fort, because when the British left, when the war was over, they just went back to England and left everything here.
For the period of time that the British fort was here, it was completely free and open society. And that was something that was highly unusual, and was also considered a high threat to the institution of slavery to the north in the American plantations and so forth.
The United States was unhappy with the occupation of the fort by a force of free blacks. In many ways, the settlement at Prospect Bluff could be called a Maroon colony. Maroons were escaped slaves who formed free communities in the Caribbean region. Although North Florida is not part of the Caribbean, the inhabitants of Prospect Bluff lived in a similar way to the Maroons of Jamaica and other places.
There was a community around the fort. They had cattle, they was farming, and I think it was up to roughly 1,100 to 1,500 Maroons that lived around. It was an entire community. And they felt safe because they were under the protection of the Negro Fort, because a lot of the what do you call bounty hunters or slave hunters would come down into Spanish Florida, even though it was a foreign country, and capture the slaves and take them back to their plantations and across the border in Alabama and Georgia for reward, just like the Old West bounty hunters.
You have a unique aspect for the Maroon community that was here, free community in existence for about 2 years, and it became a beacon of hope for a lot of people who escaped and came here to seek freedom. And whether or not they stayed here and moved on, it was remembered for generations as sort of iconic for the symbol of freedom that it offered to people who were trying to get away from bondage.
A lot of people don't realize that the first Underground Railroad came south into Spanish Florida rather than north into Canada. And more came into Florida. One reason for it, the proximity. So why would you, if you were an escaped slave, go 900 miles up to Canada when you can go just a few miles across into Spanish Florida, which was a foreign country at the time?